I wanted to talk first with Michael Rubin, senior resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, about the president's decision to reorganize American lines in Syria. Mr. Rubin has been a frequent guest on the show for years. His latest op-ed, Syria Could Be Turkey's Vietnam, I have posted over at HughHewitt.com. Michael, welcome. Good to have you. I hope you're having a good fast.
Thank you very much, Hugh. So far, so good. It's easier the first hours of the fast rather than the last one.
That's what I gather. So I'm glad that you could make time for us on Yom Kippur. Michael, I am one of those who agree with the president that 10 months ago, and I went with John Bolton to Jerusalem and Ankara. 10 months ago, he told him eventually we're not going to be this far forward. We're going to reorganize backwards. Now Turkey is threatening to move, I guess, east of the Euphrates. David Ignatius had tweets last night saying it's imminent. First of all, what do you understand to be the situation on the ground before we talk about what that means?
The situation is it remains imminent. We've withdrawn perhaps a few dozen or pulled back a few dozen forces which were in coordination with the Turks. That said, the other issue which has changed, too, is that we are no longer coordinating with the Turks on the airspace. However, we haven't stopped controlling the airspace, so this has complicated Turkish plans because they assume that they would have a green light when it came to the control of the airspace, and they do not.
But the president did say he would in no way cooperate with, in no way applaud any move by Turkey, and that, in fact, if Turkey moved in a way that was inimical to Kurdish interests, there would be economic reprisals. Did you judge that to be not true?
Well, there were the order of the tweets, Hugh, and there was some question as to whether this was simply just a reaction to the criticism. But when it comes to facts on the ground, the question is, if the facts on the ground have changed completely, whether economically punishing Turkey would change those issues which are of most concern, for example, to American national security, the continued detention of the Islamic State prisoners, as well as the simple fact that when Turkey has controlled that border in the past, we've had it become basically a way station for the Islamic State.
That is true. Now, you write in your piece, the Kurdish-administered regions of Syria are the most secure and tolerant within the country. Erdogan's desire to conquer them has far less to do with supposed terrorism and more to do with the desire to expand Turkey's borders, eradicate the precedent of any Kurdish self-government, not subordinate to Turkish dictates, and to grab local oil wells. And then you note the Turkish move on Cyprus 45 years ago and suggest this is the same sort of situation. If, in fact, they're grabbing turf and oil, are they going to be likely in the business of letting ISIS run rampant with the black flags again?
Ultimately, that is one possibility, but the broader problem, Hugh, is that the United States and Turkey have fundamentally different notions of what constitutes a terrorist group. Let's put the Kurds aside for a moment. One of the greatest concerns to American forces and American strategists, this is why people like Defense Secretary Mattis resigned, is that many of the Turkish proxy groups have incorporated former fighters from the Islamic State or would match what the United States believes to be al-Qaeda.
Now, again, that's a new development for me. I had not heard that when I went to Turkey. I had heard that, in fact, there would be a vacuum into which ISIS could once again march with the black flags flying, even though Raqqa is not being evacuated and even though southern Syria, where the American troops are, remain supported by American troops. But you're saying because of this realignment, we have to worry about the rebirth of ISIS?
Absolutely, we do. The United States has plugged the vacuum. We have plugged the vacuum with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are predominantly Kurdish. But when it comes to the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army, some members of that Free Syrian Army, especially the former members of Jabhat al-Nusra, which has gone through several name changes, are affiliates with al-Qaeda. That is one of the concerns. Turkey, of course, would say that the Syrian Democratic Forces are predominantly affiliated with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the so-called PKK, which has waged an insurgency inside Turkey for more than 40 years. And so that is where Turkey is coming from. I've traveled back and forth to northeast Syria, and while there is still some affiliation with the PKK, when you look at any database of attacks and so forth, Turkey would be very hard-pressed to suggest that many, if any, attacks had come from the areas of Syria in which they are now talking about entering.
And a former senior national security official told me that whenever Erdogan sees a Kurd with a gun, he labels them PKK and a terrorist. I understand that. But what I'm getting at is the reality of the critics of the president's move, in essence, are saying we have to garrison that area forever. Am I wrong?
No. You're not wrong. What I would argue is I would quibble over the term forever. Right now, because at this point, the problem is mostly Erdogan. And in the future, for example, the opposition party inside Turkey doesn't approach Syria with the same issue. One of the other problems is if Turkey goes into northeastern Syria, the Kurds aren't going to simply submit themselves. You have the possibility, for example, Saudi Arabia arming those Kurds to conduct a proxy war. The Kurds have nowhere to go, and so you could have a greater proxy war, a greater terrorist campaign or insurgency inside of Turkey itself. And you could have the fact that the Kurds, if forced to choose between Turkey and Syria, would go back to Bashar al-Assad. That brings us to the concern about the land bridge, the so-called Iranian supply route that goes through Iraq, over land, and potentially into Syria, Lebanon, the Eastern Mediterranean. The whole reason our forces are there, garrisoned largely, they're not fighting, is to conduct intelligence operations and to disrupt the ability of the Iranians to facilitate that land bridge.
I understand that. That's why I'm glad we're not evacuating from the south because of the land bridge. But I want to go back to the beginning. I think I heard an admission against interest there, which is we will have to garrison it at least until Erdogan is gone. It reminded me of when James Madison would write to Thomas Jefferson in Paris about how Patrick Henry was frustrating him. And Jefferson wrote back, then we shall just have to pray that he dies, about Henry. So what we're talking about here is we have an Erdogan problem. And unless he has a massive heart attack, though, we're going to have an Erdogan problem for 2 decades. So you're proposing a occupation of northern Syria by American troops for maybe 20 to 30 years until Erdogan dies and normal people take the country back over in Kemal Ataturk's vision?
Hugh, I'm talking about the presence of 100 troops that aren't fighting, that are gathering intelligence, and frankly would be an investment on the alternative, which would be a rebirth of the Islamic State. It's not simply a question of let's have troops there or we have absolutely no investment. The real concern of the president's critics in this issue is that the removal of those troops at this point in time, the abandonment of the Kurds at this point in time, would allow for a rebirth of al-Qaeda.
But here, Michael, here's my problem. And I was all against it 10 months ago because I thought it was too sudden. No one had any notice. No one knew what he was talking about. But it's been 10 months. Is that a garrison is a garrison is a garrison. And we have to be honest with the American people, whether it's 50 or 500, that's the long end of a tail, and it's a tripwire force. And Turkey has threatened to invade over that tripwire force repeatedly. And if that happens, we have NATO member against NATO member firing hot rounds, right?
The question is whether you believe Turkey's bluff, whether you believe that Turkey would do that with us there, and whether you believe the alternative would be worse. If you believe that the alternative would be a safe haven that would allow the Islamic State's rebirth, then yes, there's a reason why we have those troops there at this point in time.
I agree. If you believe that was going to happen.
Hugh, if I may push back, the president has threatened to use economic leverage against the Turks should they decide that should they act poorly. Why not actually use the economic leverage to stop the saber rattling? Why not point out to the Turks repeatedly and often that there has not been a single terrorist attack? There has been one terrorist attack from northeastern Syria against Turkish forces, and the person for that was caught by the Kurds.
All good points, Michael, but I go back to the coup attempt in 2015, 2016. It's in 2016 under Obama. When the coup attempt failed and Erdogan basically imprisoned half of the military brass and Turkish senior officials began to flee to Europe or stay in Europe, the country changed significantly to a one-man system. It's a dictatorship. He's a dictator. And if you're willing to run that kind of risk with American troops, then you will have a NATO-on-NATO member conflict, which has never happened in the history of NATO. I
Well,
just want people
let
to
me push
understand
that.
the stakes.
Let me push back on that. First of all, you've had skirmishing between Turkey and Greece before, but let me push back on that for a second. When you have a track record of Erdogan caving under pressure, when he didn't fulfill his demands, for example, in the aftermath of the 2010 Mavi Marmara incident, that's when a Turkish ship that was affiliated actually with an organization that works with al-Qaeda tried to get into Gaza. When you have separately Erdogan backing down in the case of Pastor Brunson because of the application of American pressure, why not apply American pressure first to stop the saber rattling? Remember when the Russians tried to cross into northeastern Syria, the United States actually
We destroyed a whole group of Russians. We killed them.
Exactly, and so we actually have credibility here.
They
The
were
question
Russians.
is,
They were
but
not Turks.
But what I'm saying here, Hugh, is why not actually, given that Erdogan has a track record of backing down under pressure, why not utilize that pressure first to stop Erdogan simply from engaging in land grabs?
And I think the response is because the downside is much greater than the upside, and the upside carries with it a far greater investment over a longer period of time. Last point, Michael.
You're artificially trying to compartmentalize this because every time you give in to Erdogan, you see that his land grabs increase. So what would be next here?
And to me, what the critics of the president are not looking at is, on the global stage, our challenge is not on the Turkish-Syria border. Our challenge is on the sea, under the sea, in space with anti-satellite weapons, and with China. And that we can't be everywhere. We really can't.
We can't be everywhere, Hugh, but 100 people is basically a very good investment if the alternative is a re-rise of the Islamic State, given that the Islamic State simply wouldn't contain itself to Syria, but has actively said, as al-Qaeda did pre-9/11, that their aim would be to attack Americans wherever they are.
And I understand that. It is always a risk. It is clearly a risk, but I am with the critics of the president.
We disagree over the assessment of Erdogan's good faith here.
No, we disagree over the likelihood of consequences that will follow from a rearrangement of America's internal lines and on the danger of a Turkish-U.S. confrontation. But we'll come back and keep talking about it. Michael, a good fast to you. Thank you for joining us this morning. Follow him at @MRubin1971.